Comrade S. Ramachandra Pillai, Comrade Riaz, Comrade Isaac, Dr. Anita Rampal, other dignitaries on the dais, comrades, friends, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for having asked me to attend this very important seminar. This is a very important seminar not only because we are discussing the issue of education, which in fact plays a crucial role in the development of society, but also because this is a mass discussion. The 19th century English writer Walter Bagehot had defined democracy as government by discussion. Now, if someone wants to know how democracy works, how government by discussion works, and how discussions have to be conducted in order to affect and change government policy, then such a person must come to Kerala and must attend the International Conference on Kerala Studies. So it's really a pleasure for me and really instructive that I have been asked to attend this seminar. Now, obviously, there are many distinguished educationists here who know about the state of education, the problems of education, both in the country and in the state, to a much greater extent than I do. So I would really not like to speak much about education as such or education policy, but I'd like to speak a little bit about the political economy that underlies this education policy. Currently, any education policy is really reflective of the class hegemony that exists in that particular society. The fact that this education policy itself has been brought out without much reference to previous education policies suggests that it is not just a development over the previous ones, but it is something which is dictated as a means of presenting before the people the kind of attitude towards education that the current hegemonic elements in society, the hegemonic classes in society have. Now, the hegemony in contemporary Indian polity is exercised by a corporate Hindutva alliance. You have an alliance between Hindutva groups on the one side and, of course, corporate elements, particularly certain significant corporate elements, certain newly emerging corporate elements. The alliance between them is what currently dominates the Indian polity and, of course, the Indian social life. Now, this corporate Hindutva alliance in our country is really a part of an international phenomenon. And that international phenomenon itself is one which is constituted by an alliance between neoliberalism on the one hand and neo-fascism on the other hand. You have a fascist government in Italy where Mussolini had been defeated exactly almost 80 years ago. You have fascist forces. You have fascist governments in Poland, in Hungary and elsewhere, in Turkey. But what is more, fascist forces are emerging to prominence everywhere in the world, including in Germany, where the fascist party is now getting almost 15% of the total votes. In the United States, there was a brief period in which fascist tendencies gained the upper hand. For the time being, they have received a setback, but they are waiting in the wings. Similarly, in France and elsewhere. Now, this emergence of fascism, or what I would call neo-fascism, is really a means of defending the interests of the ruling classes, of monopoly capital, of neoliberalism in a period of crisis of neoliberalism. You always find fascism emerging in a period of capitalist crisis. In the 1930s, fascism emerged when there was mass unemployment all over the capitalist world because of the Great Depression. Now again, world capitalism has run into a crisis, which is a crisis of the neoliberal phase, which actually shows that neoliberal capitalism has reached a kind of dead end, and within that dead end, it now is making alliances with fascistic, neo-fascistic groups in order to sustain its hegemony in society. Fascist and neo-fascist groups always exist in any modern society, but they acquire center stage with the financial support of the monopoly capitalists, with the media support provided by the monopoly capitalists, precisely in a period when monopoly capitalists feel themselves threatened by the fact of crisis and growing unemployment. That is when a change in the direction of discourse away from material facts of life, away from material conditions of living of the working people, towards generating hatred for the other, generating hatred for some minority group, some hapless minority group, then it becomes essential for the very survival of fascism, and that for the very survival of capitalism, and that is when capitalism makes alliances with all these hitherto fringe elements. And this alliance retains its hegemony by not only using state power, state apparatus to coerce opponents, to force opponents, but also by using its own gang of thugs, using its own gang of hoodlums in order to terrorize all kinds of opponents. Now, this is something which we are finding in our country. I don't really have to give examples. I mean, I don't really have to establish this. You look at the election taking place in Karnataka. There is hardly any discussion from the point of view of the ruling party of the bread and butter issues, of problems of unemployment, of problems of inflation, of problems of material living as far as the bulk of the people are concerned. But the talk is about a uniform civil code by which you generally target a minority. And therefore, this is something which is really visible before our eyes, and I would submit that the purpose of this education policy is to, in fact, bolster the position of the corporate Hindutva alliance in the polity and in society. How does it do so? Well, obviously, any corporate Hindutva alliance or a neoliberal, neo-fascist alliance more generally is one that would like to destroy any critical thought. It would like to destroy creativity in society. Why? Because any creativity entails going beyond the given. We have a given society. To be creative, one has to go beyond the given. To go beyond the given, you have to critique the given. And therefore, creativity necessarily requires a critical attitude towards what is given. And it is in the interest both of neoliberalism and of neo-fascism, and therefore of the neoliberal neo-fascist alliance, to ensure that there is no critique of the given, to ensure that anyone critical of what is there in society, what exists, is one who is suppressed, called anti-national, and all the rest of it. Now, how does the education policy achieve this end? I would like to just give you a few illustrations of how this comes about. There are three different groups of people, in my view, which would be created once this new education policy gets implemented. One group of people, of course, is the ordinary people. The ordinary people would be, in general, excluded from the ambit of education or academic activities. Now, this is, of course, dangerous, because the presumption behind democracy is that everybody should have the capacity to form judgments on every issue. That is why, the presumption of democracy is to break up the so-called cult of the expert. That is only the experts who know, we ordinary people don't know. No, democracy means that the ordinary people are the ones who are going to be the arbiters between the experts. And if so, then they must be able to form judgments for which a certain amount of academic education is absolutely essential. Now, if you exclude people from the ambit of that academic education, in that case, you are essentially destroying the roots of democracy anyway. How does that exclusion come about? You look at the new education policy, there is talk of people moving out at different stages, at the school level and even at the undergraduate level. There are different points of exit. Now, these points of exit are sought to be covered up by referring to flexibility, by referring to the need for vocational education being introduced and so on. But all that camouflages the fact that these are essentially points of exit. Of course, vocational education is absolutely important. In fact, vocational education should be made a part of academic education anyway. But on the other hand, to deny academic education in the name of vocational education is, as I said, undermining the roots of democracy. So what you have, therefore, are these points of exit, which is one way that education is going to be denied to people who are then going to drop out. Particularly, the poorer students would therefore drop out. The second is, for instance, now there is talk of a common entrance exam for entering universities. Now that is actually a commoditization of university entrance. Earlier you worked, you produced good results in your school living exam, and therefore you got admitted to the university. A child from a poor background had as much chance of getting admission, provided the child from a poor background did well in the school living exam, as a child from the rich background. It is true that they are not on an equal footing. The child from the rich background would have a better chance of doing well in the final exams, but at least the child from a poor background had a chance. Now what happens is, if you have a common entrance exam, in that case you would have coaching classes. If you have coaching classes, then you have to pay money to attend those coaching classes. Your final school living exams are not good enough for you to get into universities. You would have to have some coaching classes for which you have to pay money. Now, the child from a poor background would not have the money to enter these coaching classes, because of which such a person gets excluded anyway, or a substantial degree of exclusion occurs as far as these students are concerned from entering universities. In the universities again, there used to be, or there still is, a system of reservations. Now, the new education policy makes no mention of reservations. Even if they stick to reservations for SC/STs, the range of reservations which had been introduced are not mentioned in the new education policy, which suggests that even that route through which some of the children from poor backgrounds could actually enter universities, enter the portals of higher education, would now be denied this kind of an entry. So at one level, we would really have, as far as the masses are concerned, far from the masses being educated in order to become citizens where they effectively participate in the political life of the country and thereby constitute a democratic force of intervention, you would actually have substantial numbers of them being excluded from the ambit of education. Let's look at the other side. Let's look at the other extreme. At the other extreme, there are some private educational institutions. Around Delhi, there are many of them, and foreign educational institutions which have been invited to set up shop in India. Now, those educational institutions have their own syllabi. They are not going to be following some university, some UGC syllabus. Therefore, you're not going to invite Harvard and then tell Harvard that when you have an offshoot in Bombay or Delhi, you must follow the syllabus that is prepared by the UGC. They would have their own syllabus. Now, any such syllabus is one that is imbued with an imperialist perspective. Let me give you an example from my own subject. If you look at colonial India was characterized by substantial drain of surplus, drain of wealth from the colonies to the metropolis. People like Dadabhai Nauroji, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, they wrote about it. And in fact, Dadabhai Nauroji was called the father of Indian nationalism. And therefore, it was a starting point of the anti-colonial struggle that this country was being exploited by Britain, and this is something which was articulated by people like Dadabhai Nauroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt. And this is not true only of India, this is true of most other third world countries that were in fact colonized. Now, I ask you, in Harvard, if you have a development economics course, they wouldn't have heard of Dadabhai Nauroji. Therefore, there is no question of such a development economics course in any of the Ivy League universities introducing you to the idea of the drain of surplus from the colonies to the metropolis. As a result, the very foundations, the very political economy foundations of the anti-colonial struggle are excluded from such a syllabus. Therefore, any such syllabus, I'm not saying it's a kind of diabolical conspiracy, but any such syllabus, by its very nature, would be one that is imbued with the imperialist perspective. And that is fine when it comes to the products of these institutions are concerned, because these products then go on to serve multinational corporations or the corporate giants within the country, and they also would not like people to be talking about the exploitation of India by metropolitan capital under colonial rule, because if they talk about it, then uncomfortable questions may be raised about what is happening to the current exploitation. Is there such an exploitation happening at the moment? And therefore, all such uncomfortable questions are avoided, and the products of these institutions would be fine as the kind of, inputs into or as recruits into metropolitan capitals, enterprises, or that of corporate India. But on the other hand, they would necessarily be people who would see no problem about the existing state of affairs, and therefore there would be people without creativity, there would be people who would not be going beyond that which exists. Now let's look at the middle group. The middle group, that means those who are not excluded and those who are not going to these prestigious institutions. The middle group would basically consist of people who would have worked hard, made their way into public universities, which they can afford as of now, and if so, then what is going to be happening to them? I submit that when it comes to public higher education system, there is an attempt at lumpenization of this education. This lumpenization is one which is again visible in front of our eyes, but I'd like to give you some illustrations of it. One, which already is getting much attention, is this complete change which is happening in the textbooks which are prescribed, and the changes, the deletions which are being made by UGC. Just imagine what the deletions are. Darwin's theory does not figure. The Mughal Empire does not figure. Poverty as a category in India does not figure. You have likewise no discussion of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who played such a big role in the freedom struggle, and so on. One can illustrate with lots of examples. But the point is that effectively, therefore, just imagine an Indian student who does not know who was responsible for building the Taj Mahal. Now the point is that therefore you have a lumpenization of education at that level through these enormous arbitrary interference in what the students are supposed to know or supposed not to know. And therefore, that is one example I'd like to give you. The second example is one which these days almost anybody, unknown characters, people who have had very little to do with academic life, are being made vice chancellors or faculty. In fact, in Delhi University at this moment, you actually have people who have been teaching in an ad hoc position for years and years being removed, and in their place, people being appointed who, it is said, are close to the RSS, to the BJP, to the ruling government and ruling powers. Now, this is something which again means that those with experience, those who have been teaching, those who actually have won the confidence of the students are being removed, and all kinds of persons whose only claim to fame is their proximity to the ruling powers are now being appointed. This is another obvious example of lumpenization of university education that is taking place. There's another example which I'd like to give you, which is particularly distressing as far as I'm concerned. My own teacher, Professor Amartya Sen, who has been living in Shantiniketan for decades. His whole family lived in Shantiniketan. His father lived in Shantiniketan. His grandfather lived in Shantiniketan. Had in fact been invited by Rabindranath Tagore to Shantiniketan to be able to teach there, and some land was leased to them. Now, the Vice Chancellor is now on an attack on Professor Sen, and they want to occupy parts. They say that he is in unauthorized occupation of some 13 decimals of land, and therefore they are really now going to take those 13 decimals away from him by encroaching on his house, on his land and so on. I would like to draw a contrast here between this, which I call an example of lumpenization, and what happens even in a bourgeois society, even in an established metropolitan bourgeois society. Jean-Paul Sartre, as you know, was a very well-known French existentialist philosopher who was a Marxist and who was totally opposed to French imperialism. He was a friend of Frantz Fanon, and he supported the Algerian War of Independence against France. Now, when Jean-Paul Sartre was engaged in the struggle against the imperialism of his own country, and his own country was engaged in a military suppression of the Algerian War of Independence, Sartre made a call to the French troops not to fire on the Algerians, but to desert the army. And he said, you don't serve these masters, you desert the army. For which, naturally, he was hauled up as a traitor to the country. The French right dubbed him a traitor to France because he was asking French troops fighting in Algeria to desert the army. But of course, the French state did nothing. De Gaulle was the president of France. And when some people asked de Gaulle, why aren't you doing something about Jean-Paul Sartre giving these open calls? De Gaulle said, one does not arrest Voltaire. In other words, a society is defined by, a society is nourished by some outstanding thinkers in its midst. You may not agree with